Are you watching?
After the success of 2022's Barbarian, considered one of that year's best horror films, most horror fans were excited to see what writer-director Zach Creggar was going to do next.
That's all I'm asking. Let me be real with you.
Barbarian was an incredible debut feature, a mainstream horror that subverted expectations usually prevalent in the genre, from its tense first act to its wild finale, navigating its often extreme tonal shifts without ever feeling uneven, but which also had a deftly delivered depth, distinct and timely themes that flowed through the film without ever overwhelming the narrative, or losing sight of the fact that this was, first and foremost, a crowd-pleasing slice of horror cinema. Was this a fluke, or simply a result of care that was unsustainable, a trick Creggar wouldn't be able to replicate? Well, with 2025's Weapons, Creggar proved that it was the exact opposite, and again delivered a well-made, thoughtful film, again awash with timely themes, and again, or perhaps even more so, first and foremost an exhilarating modern horror flick that uses its structure to play with tone, a film that despite its over 2-hour runtime, proved itself to be a crowd-pleasing spectacle, a bona fide horror blockbuster, pulling in nearly $300 million at the box office, making it one of the 30 highest-grossing horror films of all time. It's well deserving of the praise it's received too, intelligently written, tightly constructed, and delivered with a devilish style, not afraid to take its time but also never dragging, with terrific performances across the board. Although I will say I thought Benedict Wong as the school principal Marcus was a particular highlight.
You know what? I'm embarrassed to say, I guess I don't really know what that means.
Creggar's camera glides through exquisitely constructed shots, easing us into the headspaces of the film's broad ensemble, and even pulling the odd jump scare out of his bag of tricks. Although even that is something of a subversion, as the monster in this film is intentionally, almost comedically, not scary in a traditional sense. Although I think it's fair to say that Aunt Gladys, portrayed in a brilliant and borderline unrecognizable turn from veteran character actor Amy Madigan, will nonetheless go down as an iconic horror villain, destined to be a fun hipster Halloween costume for years to come. If you're familiar with my videos, you'll know I'm not interested in recounting the plots of the films I look at. I'm going to assume that anyone watching this will have seen the film and won't need it explained to them beat by beat like a preschooler. And I instead want to look at the themes of the film, or at least what I thought they were, and hopefully you'll find that entertaining, so spoiler warning for Weapons. If you haven't seen the film, I strongly recommend you do so before watching the rest of this video.
I would feel so much better if I could just speak with him.
Right there.
What?
That's the problem. You'd feel so much better.
Where Barbarian made use of a 3-act structure to unspool its disparate stories, for Weapons, Creggar has cribbed from Kurosawa's Rashomon for a less linear experience, each chapter following one character through a portion of the narrative, often overlapping with the events seen in other chapters, until we are finally presented with the full picture of the events of the film. While some recent films have used similar devices solely as a trick to obscure plot twists that are made inevitable by telegraphing their non-linearity, here it is used to focus on individual characters and their intertwining roles in the narrative, their different perspectives recontextualizing the events of the film as much as the disjointed plotting does, creating a tightly woven tapestry presented to the viewer piecemeal, before its full splendor is revealed in a final act that culminates in one of the most fist-pumping finales in modern horror history. And I think that lets us in on one of the key aspects of the film, not just that everyone matters, that the background characters are the protagonists of their own stories, the film not following a main character contrasted to one-note background bit parts, but that everyone we meet is part of a larger living, breathing world, constantly intersecting and deviating, different paths that are never less valid just because they sometimes remain out of sight. And also, perhaps more importantly, this feeds into an overarching theme that these characters and we as viewers need different perspectives to see the whole truth, the whole story, the full picture.
Oh my God.
What?
Alex Lilly lives in this house.
I've heard that many call Weapons a gun violence or perhaps school shooting allegory. And while there are aspects of that, too many to be coincidental, I don't think that's quite what Creggar is going for, at least not in totality. On first watch, I did actually feel that this is where the story was heading, not just in the not-so-subtle symbolism, but the way Josh Brolin's Archer in particular mirrored the grief of parents who had lost children in those circumstances, presenting a story of a man looking for someone to blame, tugging at the connective tissue of tragedy, hoping to have it make sense when it never could. I had guessed that witchcraft was the means, because come on, the word witch was literally daubed in red paint on the side of a car that appears in multiple shots. One example of a prolific use of foreshadowing employed by Creggar. But I initially anticipated that the culprit, if that's the right word, would be Alex, the one child remaining from his class, portrayed early in the film as distant, perhaps even a little creepy. That maybe we would find at the heart of this mystery a bullied kid who had done something truly terrible out of spite and anger. But when the film flips to his perspective, it's far from that simple. Perspective matters. Always. And while Alex's actions did lead to the disappearance of his classmates, when the story is seen through his eyes, it is inconceivable that he should have to take responsibility. And he in fact becomes a carer, not just to his immobilized parents, but to the weaponized children. He is as much, if not more, the victim of this narrative as anyone, and far from being the villain, he is ultimately the hero of this story. This technique of flipping perspective shows us that none of these characters are perfect, all of them have faults, but they aren't evil either. Take Josh Brolin's Archer. Harassing a teacher and graffitiing their car may be reprehensible, inexcusable, but these acts are shown to us as manifestations of grief. Explicable if misplaced, a father looking for answers, casting around for someone to blame and alighting on the wrong target. He bullishly, maybe arrogantly charged after his quarry, lacking the perspective that would show him that he was tormenting an innocent. Because of the structure of the film, a viewer is aware of this while watching Archer's story. We have already seen the strand of the film that primarily follows Julia Garner's Justine. But we too, or at least certainly me, can be guilty of making assumptions without having the full knowledge of everyone's perspective. As I say, for much of its runtime, I assumed this was an allegory for school shootings, and was waiting to see Alex's story as confirmation of my theory. I was wrong, because I didn't have the whole picture. And that is, I think, largely what Creggar is going for, that the animosity we feel towards others is often misplaced, based on assumptions, a belief that we are the main character of the stories that make up our lives, that we are moral and virtuous, our imperfections only human, while the imperfections of others are far more sinister, proof positive of a guilt that pervades their whole being.
And I've found out a lot. She had a DUI 2 years ago. Did you not see that?
Amplified by the wisdom of crowds and echo chambers.
It's
She
not.
should be locked up until she tells us what happened.
Blame too easily attributed, informed by a lack of understanding, too often compounded by an inability or unwillingness to see the world through the eyes of others. With Weapons, Creggar has fashioned a marriage of structure and theme, not just stylistic trickery, but a layer of craft that reinforces and informs the way a viewer appreciates the film. It is, of course, far from the only example of this, and maybe one of the most prominent is the now iconic Weapons run. You may be aware that this is based on an iconic piece of imagery itself, a photograph known as the Terror of War, which depicts a young Vietnamese girl, her clothes burned off by napalm following an attack by the US-backed South Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. The girl herself was then 9-year-old Phan Thi Kim Phuc, and the picture was perhaps the most iconic of a conflict that saw the first large-scale domestic anti-war protests, largely due to pervasive news coverage of its brutality. So powerful was this single image that then US President Richard Nixon queried whether it had been staged, 'cause of course he did. After all, he had to be dissuaded from dropping a nuclear bomb on the country by one of the greatest monsters of the late 20th century, Henry Kissinger. And if Kissinger is the sane voice in the room, that room must be pretty batshit. While later in life Kim Phuc was granted asylum in Canada and has set up foundations to provide aid to child victims of war, as a teen she was withdrawn from her medical degree by the Vietnamese government, who decided to use her as a symbol, forcing her into rounds of interviews as a propaganda tool, an experience for which she paid a hefty toll, telling CBS's Jane Pauley, "I didn't know what was going on, but I know that I couldn't go to school. I can tell you it was a low point in my life. I became another kind of victim again, and it filled me up with hatred, bitterness, and anger." Later writing in an op-ed for the New York Times, photographs by definition capture a moment in time, but the surviving people in these photographs, especially the children, must somehow go on. We are not symbols. We are human. We must find work, people to love, communities to embrace, places to learn and to be nurtured. As well as her image being symbolic of the horrors of war, she was later effectively weaponized by her own government. A young woman already dealing with trauma pushed onto a stage, microphones thrust in her face, the victimhood of an innocent itself weaponized. And maybe there is a deeper point to its use in weapons too, perhaps broadly. Think of the children too often becoming a justification for oppression itself, and specifically in Archer's story, how a missing son can become a justification for more victimization, that the victimhood of others can become a symbol that motivates weaponization in turn, reinforcing our own perspectives instead of considering those of others. But in none of this have I accounted for one thing, the role of Aunt Gladys.
I am sorry to tell you this, sweetie, but I am on the verge of collapse.
Although there is, apparently, an upcoming prequel set to rectify this, we are never really shown events from Gladys's point of view, and she is instead a villain of almost comical one-dimensionality, selfishness personified, seeking only to satisfy her own ends, almost all of the cruelty in the film springing either directly or indirectly from her weathered, spindly fingers. And perhaps that's enough, that she is no pink match setting alight the wick of the film's narrative, something weird and beyond the understanding of these characters, a force so beyond their imagination and comprehension that they instead seek more explicable targets. That actually works perfectly fine, that she is a representation of the unimaginable. But what if there's actually a little bit more? There's also the theme of parasites throughout the film, with a TV documentary watched by Marcus and his partner seeming to clue us in on Gladys's nature, a parasitic organism that puppets its prey, as well as the topic of parasites being what Justine was teaching her class before they vanished.
Who else can think of an example of a parasite?
And that's a cute way to foreshadow a plot development, but again, maybe it's actually a little more, possibly an even cuter reference. If you've made it this far into the video or are watching my channel in general, I'm going to assume you've probably watched some other films at some point, and may have heard of a little picture called Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's anti-capitalist masterpiece, that portrays the lower and upper classes as symbiotic parasites living in an economic system that leeches off them both. The most information we are given about the backstory of Aunt Gladys, the parasite of weapons, is a line that is again very cute, maybe the single best line of the whole film.
Oh, no, it's not serious. Nothing terminal. It's just a touch of consumption.
A touch of consumption?
Obviously, this functions on the level of both a joke, and also informing a viewer that Gladys is very, very old, using an obsolete name for tuberculosis that was common in the 1800s. But there is a double meaning here too, not just in the way Gladys herself seemingly only exists to consume, and only consumes to continue existing. An old decrepit power on its last legs, a parasitic entity on the verge of collapse, leeching off the young to maintain and extend her life. But also in how consumption, how being consumers, no longer individuals but massed together into expanding markets that demand servicing, necessitating mass production and homogeneity, a feedback loop of ever-increasing growth and ever-increasing demand, is the hallmark of modern capitalism.
I can make them eat each other if I want to.
And the closer you are to the source, the more subjugated you are in its thrall, weaponized beyond free will, husks that exist as attack dogs, who can only survive by being spoon-fed, in this instance from cans of Campbell's soup, iconic in their own right and through the work of Andy Warhol, as symbols of mass-produced consumerism, and either intentionally or symptomatically, as symbolic of the devolution of art itself in a consumerist society.
There's soup in the cabinet. Tomorrow you'll get some more.
Weapons is a film set entirely in the suburbs, its players largely middle-class consumers, value displayed by their well-kept homes.
I'd really like a clean house. That includes your room, so.
Nice cars, even children. Consumption a representation of your status in this society.
Good. Kiss any supermodels?
Who ultimately become the slaves of this necrotic crone. The worst off. A homeless addict spiraling hopelessly, desperately trying to cobble together enough money to keep the wolf of withdrawal from his door. A guardian of capital, the dickhead cop who takes his frustrations out on suspects. And the most impressionable, children, still learning about this world, potential ready to be primed, awaiting direction.
He was weaponized, like a heat-seeking missile just locked onto you.
You may feel that this is something of a leap to take based on one line, which itself actually functions perfectly well, not just as a joke, but in establishing character, even without this meaning. But Weapons is a film conspicuously awash with the symbolism of consumerism, from its cozy middle-class neighborhoods to constant prominent framing of its iconography. Not just Campbell's soup, but Coke cans, people hawking their wares to the mega-wealthy on Shark Tank, 7 hot dogs. Rest in peace, Trevor Moore. Consumption is everywhere in this film. Even Gladys herself is a rotting rictus Avon lady, a barely resuscitated corpse pantomiming a performance of femininity, who seeks solely to consume, her power rippling through this world. A corrupted root that sprouts into an orchard of toxicity, violence and trauma its irresistible fruit. And perhaps we should also ask the question of who is telling this story. The unseen narrator, a little girl, bookending the film, giving it the feel of a fairy tale, not an exact recounting of a true story, but a fable, with a moral and a theme, a lesson to be learned underneath its narrative. So what is the moral of this fable? Is the end state that those who have been forged into nothing but missiles, wrecking whatever is in their path, will become so destructive they'll eventually tear the whole thing down? A dire warning for those who would use their power to weaponize others. Maybe. Or maybe, to bring this back around to something more hopeful and constructive, it's that we should seek to understand the perspectives of others, navigate the destruction that's been caused by forces we can barely comprehend, reach out to each other and realize that we don't have to be weapons at all. Thank you very much for watching. If you listened to this, you made it all the way to the end and deserve a cookie. If you enjoyed this, please like and share and subscribe if you don't already. Feel free to comment below if you saw weapons differently to me or just want to say hi. If you do subscribe, sorry for the break between this and my last video. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.